Teresa, how are you today? Thank you for taking your
I
time.
am wonderful. Thank you, Sanjar. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Who is Teresa and what do you do?
So, I'm Teresa Chambers. I'm the founder of 10th Muse Enterprises. I help founders and brands connect strategically with their target audiences through storytelling and communication strategies.
That's incredible. And I know your work is at the intersection of marketing strategy, brand visibility. How do you explain the difference between strategy and tactics to a business owner who thinks they are kind of the same, it's kind of the same thing?
Absolutely. That's something I run into all the time. And I always have to let people know that the tactics, like they can always come to me and say, I want to be on social media. Well, social media is a tactic. And before you decide on the tactics that you are going to use to achieve your business goals, you have to understand what those business goals are. And that's where your strategy comes in. So thinking about what the outcomes are that you want to have in your business, and then putting a plan together for what's actually going to produce the best outcomes. That's when the tactics come into play, like what social media strategy you're going to use, or if you're going to really prioritize social media. Because if you're targeting a client who is not on a particular channel, or if you're targeting businesses and you're targeting CEOs who are very likely not even on social media, that's not necessarily the best priority for you with limited spending dollars for marketing. So that's something to think about. That's part of the strategy.
Interesting. Interesting. So let's go back to that CEO audience, right?
Yeah,
So you telling me what I'm hearing directly, if you don't utilize the social media, there are ways, depends who's your audience is, you can actually create a successful marketing campaign without using social media. Depends on your audience.
absolutely. So, social media has a role as for awareness, right? For the brand awareness. But in terms of actual conversion, then you have to get directly in front of your customers.
Yeah.
And your customers, if they're not looking for you on a social media platform, if they aren't making decisions based on what they see on a social media post, then that's not the way that you make your priority in terms of your marketing outreach. You have to, in order to get more access and be more direct, you have to determine what those channels are to actually get you closer to your target
Hmm.
customer.
Interesting. Many small business owners actually start their company because they love what they do. Let's take fitness coaches, right?
Yes.
But loving your craft does not automatically makes you successful, right? Especially in the business world. What is the mindset shift you coach theme like you coach them through first to make sure before they start the business they need to be aware of X, Y, and Z?
You're absolutely right. That's something that a lot of business owners who are starting out are faced with because they start a business because they're passionate about whatever field they're in. However, when they make that pivot to business owner, then actually their job changes, right? So they're not providing the service alone. Now they have to think about themselves as the CEO of their business. So their job, if you imagine, if you've been working in a corporate environment, if you have been executing a particular role, then that's your job and your job description. But the CEO is the leader and the decision maker about that business. Well, now, once you step out of a corporation and you become your own business, then the first priority is for you to have yourself as the CEO. So there's the shift. What is the job description of the CEO? Because typically the CEO is not the person who's actually executing on the work that's producing the revenue, that's producing the services and products. So that's really a tough mind shift for a lot of new business owners to make.
That's crazy, and I'm sure majority of business owners, that's where they fail tremendously. It's not because they're good at what they do.
Absolutely. A lot of times it really comes down to working on the business versus working in the business. And so if you're working in the business, that means you're doing the day to day execution, but you have to step back and really think about what are my bigger goals? How am I going to, because you can only work so many hours a day. I always like to refer to Jeff Bezos, right? It's like he could not possibly work the number of hours equal to the amount of revenue he brings
The
in.
output, yeah, the output by Amazon, absolutely.
Yeah.
And same goes to any big, large business owners, right?
Any, yes.
Obviously, you have a lot of experience working corporate America, a lot of experience working with profit centric organizations and nonprofit. I guess, if you don't mind me asking, what is one universal mistake you see organizations make when launching something new?
Well, when launching something new, what I think a lot of times happens is that there isn't enough planning because people are so focused on getting to the results, getting to the output, getting to the proof. So putting the plan together and investing upfront in that plan is really important because anytime you're launching something, a lot of the investment goes on the front end. And many organizations, large and small, are not necessarily prepared to launch. Corporations that do have a lot of staff, they typically have to draw on their internal staff. And so that can definitely be an advantage if they have those folks. If you're drawing on a staff that already has a lot of responsibilities, then that absolutely can create some strains for the business and ultimately lead to less than optimal outcomes for a new launch. So, having the plan in place and really understanding what the resources are that are required, both in manpower and in financials, is really important to have a successful launch.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And, speaking of target, right? A lot of B2B marketing requires a fundamental different strategy versus going direct to consumer, right? There's a big difference between B2B and B2C, right?
Yes.
Can you maybe break it down for a business owner who has been treating B2B and B2C kind of the same way? Is it a ritual? Because I personally speak from my agency, AI agency, I know we have different strategies when I'm approaching B2B sector versus B2C. We're talking about completely different systems.
It's very different. You're right, because what you're thinking about when you're talking business to business, you really are talking about oftentimes selling to multiple decision makers. You go to a large corporation, and typically you're not just selling to one buyer. You have to convince a team of people who have various priorities and interests. You have to sell them into the idea and the value of whatever it is that you're serving. So, one, the big challenge is the time that it takes to do that because, of course, leaders have multiple priorities. And so, oftentimes, they are not available all at the same time. And there are different factors that come into play for each department that has an interest. I have a background in project management as well. So I think a lot about, the stakeholder engagement. And that's one part of the process, the early stage of launching anything new. But getting that stakeholder buy-in requires a lot more time than typically when you're talking about direct to consumer. And also, typically you're selling a higher cost item with a longer term commitment. And so thinking about that, there has to be some consideration in terms of where those resources are going to come from. It's one thing to decide, I take the publishing industry. If you're going to purchase a book for 20, $30, that's a very easy decision to make as an individual. However, if you're selling to a publishing company, a licensing project, there are a lot more stakeholders. There's assets and resources that have to be selected, and there has to be a team organized. And so that takes more time. And understanding the actual profit model for something like that all has to be factored in. Even if it's something that the publisher's done before, you bring something new, they have to consider all of those elements. So that's one industry, and it varies from industry to industry what those considerations might be that could ultimately lengthen the time from making an initial offer to actually signing a contract versus going to the store and picking up a product off the shelf.
Yeah. Yeah. So wow, that was you went radical with that example. That's funny. And as a former athlete, I certainly noticed, right, when you're sponsoring even yourself and signing an agreement with a large agency and versus just asking an individual to sponsor you to allow you to have a shot to go pro in whatever the sport you are. My gosh, if you don't know how to execute different agency relationship versus one person relationship, you certainly can lose up on a lot of finances because of the fact that you're giving up a lot of rights that you didn't know that you are, right? And from the marketing standpoint, let's talk about spraying and praying, right? That is kind of one of my favorite topics because a lot of my friends, a lot of individuals I talk to, business owners, they usually start a company, especially we entrepreneurs known for being creative bug, right? We always want to create, oh, I want to add this. I want to add this to my company. I've heard a statement probably from several business owners that have built large companies outside of the spraying and praying.
Yeah.
You got to learn the riches are in the niches, right? How do you help them to get laser focused when you are working with entrepreneurs and business owners and companies to understand that mentality? Like, listen, yes, there's a lot of great ideas, but can we just get good at one thing and get laser focused on their audience, identify the audience, and actually penetrate deeper? And then let's go
Absolutely.
land and expand.
And then expand. Yes. So, one of the first thing that I always say when people say, I want to reach everybody is as a marketer, I say, well, how big is your budget? Because we know that acquiring a new customer could cost 70, 80, $100 each, right? So if you think about targeting everybody, then you have to have a huge budget. And if you're starting out, you're not willing or able to allocate those kinds of dollars, right? So that's one of the arguments. That's the biggest argument, the most obvious one. But in reality, from a strategic perspective, targeting a niche allows you to really not only get faster results, but it also allows you to test. So you can make mistakes and continue to grow with a smaller niche without losing as much. So even if you are trying to break even or or see some margins and really understand what your unique value proposition is, that's where you get that opportunity because then you get to build relationships. You get to tell your story, adjust, adapt, and then determine what is really the essence that people are buying from you. And then as you figure that out, you find new opportunities to scale because there's a lot of assumptions that we're making when we're starting something new. And when you're assuming something, you got to try it. And you get an opportunity to really learn the truth about the market. And markets change, they evolve. And so what was true before isn't true today. And we can certainly look at that with regard to AI, right? AI has changed so many things so quickly. And so what you thought was going to work 6 months ago just may not take off today.
So true, right? 2 years ago, the agentic level on AI wise was not even a thing. How we can scale ourselves right now through AI is absolutely unbelievable. And I always encourage my friends and entrepreneurs I do business with just to get good at your competitive advantage. Like, why should I think of you? Right. And kind of go back to riches and the niches. Because we as an entrepreneurs do want to capture as much of a market as possible, market share as possible to make profit,
Yes,
right? But that's just
absolutely.
not the strategy. It's really nice to hear and refreshing to hear that when you are building out the right marketing division, right? That is the case as well. You just have such an incredible, impressive resume, having worked with major organizations like American Heart Association and IBM, as well as being an entrepreneur yourself. What marketing principles do you find apply universally, regardless of what company size?
Well, I think the main focus has to be on understanding who your target market is. I think target market and market fit is so critical. And then what your unique value proposition is. How are you differentiating yourself? People will say, I always like to use the real estate example. So, you go into a networking event and, there's a bunch of realtors and everybody says, I'm a realtor. Okay, well, there's a million of them. So why would I pick one over the other? What is that differentiator, right? Because we all need to live in a house. So there has to be a way that you're going to tell your story that is going to make someone remember you and also make the choice, as they learn more about you, as they compare to others. Ultimately, what is that one thing or a couple of things that make them say, okay, out of all the options I have, I choose 10th Muse. I
Makes
choose
sense.
any brand.
And
So those are the things that are different.
yeah, and you got to
Yeah.
communicate that well. And you got to believe that well. And
Yes.
don't be greedy about saying no because it's just not your target at this very moment.
Absolutely. You know, you don't have to have everybody as your customer in order to be very successful. You can be very successful with a small percentage of the market that you're in. And so depending on what your aspirations are, you can aim for just even, 1% of your market, your entire market. And that could be a high generating business for you. But if you want to grow bigger, then absolutely you can do that too. But it's always in phases, right? You don't start out unless you have a lot of resources to begin. That you don't start out with targeting the largest possible segment. You can do gradual growth and then you can see that incremental success that you have. And that's something really to feel good about as well, is seeing that incremental success, learning more about your business, learning more about how you want to operate in your business. And then ultimately, you can grow to exit or you can grow to really scale and have impact.
What about the entrepreneurs that have a zero budget? What's one thing you recommend them to focus on?
Yeah, a lot of people do have zero budget. Thank goodness we have AI now, right? Because AI is such a great resource for using $0 to really leverage in terms of developing a plan. People talk about it in such a broad way, and they don't really understand that there are different aspects and elements to AI. So you can use AI simply, the chat functions on ChatGPT or Claude. You can use that foundational tool, and that is helpful for building out your story, developing your messaging, and then putting together a content plan for your tactics, right? So anything from once you decide you're going to use social media, what is that content going to look like, to creating a pitch deck if you're going to solicit funding, or, developing a presentation or doing research. That's another key tool use for AI that I think a lot of folks really don't understand. It's not just like typing in something like you were doing a Google search, but actually doing deep research about your industry, about the opportunities that exist. If you're pursuing B2B opportunities and you're positioning yourself as a thought leader, well, you can research, where should I be showing up? Where can I be speaking? What podcasts would be interested in having me on? All of those things can be done through AI at no cost. So that's the kind of thing to think about. But also, I think, networking still works. One of the things I think is really important is that in the face of AI, what I've come to understand is that in-person authenticity, reality is much more valued because of what the potential for lack of reality is with AI. So really thinking about where you can show up in reality so people can get to know you truthfully, authentically, and build those relationships is also critically important. And that really doesn't cost a lot.
I was going to ask if you see any threat that AI can bring to the brand authenticity, but obviously you talking about that in-person touch, human touch can truly compel you, tell your story to a level that AI can't.
Absolutely. I am an optimist, so I see the value and use of AI, but I also think that the threat really becomes people become overly dependent on using AI instead of really thinking through what it is that they actually are attempting to achieve. Because I've been there when I was first starting out using the tools, just kind of, it's the tools are trained to give you positive feedback, right? And so they're going to just tell you everything you say is great, everything you do is great. And, and you can get lost, you can go down a rabbit hole with that, but you also can, if you continue down the rabbit hole and you don't get true validation of your ideas and your products in the real world, then you're going to lose time. You can waste time and you can miss your mark. And that is just going to bring frustration. And then if you go back to AI for more answers, that's going to create a negative loop. So that's the thing I'm concerned about, being judicious about using AI, always having that human component where you actually review and fact check is really important before you make a decision simply because of a response to a prompt that you put into AI.
If we can wrap this call up with advice to entrepreneurs when it comes down to marketing.
Well, I will say that especially at this moment where there is so much focus on AI, as I have been doing my research and thinking about visibility, especially for a brand, one of the things that stands out to me is that your story is so important and you control the narrative. So it used to be just last year where Google search was your priority and that search engine optimization was really critical. Whereas now it's AE optimization. So it's that artificial intelligence optimization. And so the way that your business and your brand is found, it's about, do you have an answer to the query that's been put out there? Not just where can you find it, which was what Google really was about. It was pulling up the websites where you could reference that information. Whereas now the GPTs are actually finding the answers and delivering them to you. So if you want to be that brand that has the answer when someone's out there looking for the products or services that you have, then you have to make sure that your story is out there and that it's answering the questions. And so creating content that really allows you to be found in this new world is the one thing that everyone needs to really learn and understand today. That's very different. It's changed the whole landscape of search.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Teresa. It's been tremendous. I hope a lot of viewers get something out of it, and I'll make sure people will be able to get in touch with you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.